Welcome to another edition of our author interview series for our GAI report on the digital economy. My guest today is Neil Chilson. Neil is a computer scientist and an attorney. He serves as Senior Research Fellow for Technology and Innovation at both the Charles Koch Institute and Stand Together, and prior to that, he was the Chief Technologist at the Federal Trade Commission. Neil's chapter focuses on whether or not big tech needs its own regulator, and this is a topic that has come up a lot recently, with seemingly no agreement between anybody on either side of the aisle about what the correct approach is. So ample ground to write something on. So thank you for joining me today, Neil. And I think it'd be helpful if you gave a overview of what you discuss in your chapter.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here, and it's been great to work on this chapter. So as Matt said, my chapter focuses on whether we need a brand new regulator to regulate big tech companies. And, many people have called for new laws that regulate big tech companies, but some have taken it a step further and say, not only do we need new laws and new regulations, we need a new entity, a new governmental entity to regulate. Of course, creating a new agency has benefits and risks, and my chapter tries to explore those benefits and risks. I look at 4 different major proposals for a digital regulator. There's the UK Competition and Market Authorities report that calls for a digital markets unit. The Stigler Center at the University of Chicago had a report that calls for a digital authority. Harold Feld, who is vice president at Public Knowledge, wrote a book called The Case for the Digital Platform Act, where he talks about a digital regulator. And then finally, and most recently, 3 senior fellows at Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center called for a digital platform agency. So my chapter looks at, on the benefit side, first I look at the general rationale for creating a new agency, which is expertise. And then I test the 4 proposals to see if they meet this rationale. And then on the cost side, I summarize the research showing that while all agencies tend toward capture, sector-specific agencies are even more likely to be captured for a bunch of reasons. And I look at those. And I look at the proposals to see if they acknowledge the capture problem and if they offer solutions to that problem. And finally, I note that creating a new agency is just more expensive than amending or changing an existing agency, giving it more enforcement authority. So in conclusion, my chapter concludes that the existing proposals have basically failed to demonstrate that creating a new agency would generate benefits that outweigh its likely risks. Most problematically, the proposals don't identify what area of expertise would give a new digital regulator a comparative advantage over existing agencies. And they don't really discuss or mitigate a digital regulator's heightened risk of capture. So judging at least by these 4 proposals, which are the prominent ones out there right now, big tech does not need its own regulator.
Yeah. So I think to unpack each of those sections a little bit, we'll start at the beginning and move our way through that. So the main thrust of the chapter focuses on, as you said, why we create agencies at all and why those reasons for creating an agency are not necessarily present for these proposals to regulate big tech. So what do you see as the main reasons for creating an agency in the first place?
Well, the classic rationale for creating an agency is expertise. The reason that we don't have the traditional rationale is that Congress can't solve all these problems because it can't be expert enough in the issues or the industry or the procedure that's necessary to address certain sets of problems. And so the idea is by delegating authority to an agency could build up specialized expertise that it can apply to a very specific set of problems or a very specific set of companies or an industry. And so that general rationale, I think, is referred back to constantly, including in these proposals where they talk about the lack of expertise or the need for a new expert agency, with including the Shorenstein report, which talks about the need for an agency that has digital DNA. The expertise is sort of infused into every pore of the new agency. And so expertise seems to be the criteria on which these proposals also justify creating a new agency.
Okay, and then based on the proposals you cover, I think you mentioned a couple different types of expertise being industry, policy, and procedural.
Yeah.
If you were to create a new agency, maybe specifically for digital platforms, which we'll get to that definition in a couple minutes, what do you think would be the most important to have between those three?
It's a great question. Maybe I could just talk a little bit about those different types of expertise. Their industry expertise would be understanding, the very specific technical details of an industry. The procedural expertise would be the kinds of things that many, many different agencies have, no matter what what industry they're dealing with. These are things like understanding the, due process and the basic economic rationales for intervention. And then there's the sort of policy expertise, which is an expertise on a specific set of problems. So, it's hard to say exactly how I would suggest a new agency would be designed. But I think the policy expertise is probably the core one. What policy expertise says is, what problems are we actually trying to solve? And so one of the things that the reports talk a lot about is different problems across a bunch of different companies, some of which are like each other, but most of them are quite different from each other. Most of the big tech companies are quite different from each other. And so in some ways, they seem to be oriented around policy expertise, but usually their call for expertise is around industry expertise. And so there's a bit of confusion. It's not clear which of these particular types of expertise the new agency that these proposals offer would specialize in, and how it would have a comparative advantage over existing agencies, many of which already have this type of policy expertise, and others, and also have very often procedural expertise as well, while they may not have specific technical knowledge about some of the different companies that are in this space.
Yeah. So kind of going off the companies, one of the other main issues that you point out with a lot of these is that they're trying to regulate digital platforms or big tech and want a sector-specific regulator for big tech and digital platforms, which I think if you were to ask a lot of people who talk about this, they could maybe name a bunch of companies that they'd want to throw in there, being the Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft ones.
Yeah.
But those, as you just said, are all very different companies. So do you think any of the proposals nail down a strict enough definition for these types of companies to make a sector-specific regulator something that is workable, that actually has a sector, or no? And if they don't, is that a problem for trying to create this type of agency?
So I don't think that they ultimately are successful in identifying what sector this sector-specific digital regulator would regulate. And it's very challenging. I mean, it's worth noting that this is really important, right? Like if a company or if a new agency is going to have a comparative advantage over, say, a general regulatory agency like the Federal Trade Commission, there needs to be something for it to be expert in. And if there isn't a specific sector that we can define, that we can identify that some common features across these companies that matter to the problems that we're trying to solve, then a new agency wouldn't have a comparative advantage. And if it doesn't have a comparative advantage, it's hard to see what the justification for its existence is. And so, the companies that we're talking about, it's easy to list them off. The main thing that they have in common is that they're big, and that they have they work online, right? Whatever that means, they have online services. And so if that's the pure definition, there's a lot of companies outside of the four that we're talking about that probably fit in that category. But when you look at like a company like Amazon, which competes with Walmart more so than it competes with Google, for example, or if you look at Microsoft and Apple, Apple is primarily a device company, and Microsoft is an operating system and cloud services company. Now, all these companies have lots of overlapping services, and they might compete with each other. And that actually brings up one of the really interesting tensions in these proposals. If these companies are all in the same sector, it would suggest that they compete with each other, right? And if they compete with each other, it's hard to see what the competition rationale for some of the regulatory approaches would be. But if they're not in the same sector, it's very hard to figure out how they would be similar enough that a regulator could be expert in all of them, in like a online retailer like Amazon plus an online advertiser like Google. These are very complicated business models. They share some features, which is what the proposals highlight a lot, right? They tend to abstract away the business differences between these companies. They abstract them up to this level of their platforms, their digital platforms that have network effects and that can raise barriers to entry by being gatekeepers. And so when they use these really abstract formulations, they don't really give enough meat there to explain what a digital regulator would be expert in. We already have agencies that are expert in platform economics. The FTC has been regulating platforms for a long time, just as the FCC has been regulating platforms for a long time. And so it's just not clear what the comparative advantage of a new agency would be, given that these proposals don't do a good job of defining the sector.
Yeah, I'm saying the theory seems to be that the current agencies, despite having regulatory backgrounds and policy backgrounds in some of these areas, don't have or aren't doing enough to go after these firms, which is another question in and of itself. But let's say that we can define big tech in a usable way, and that
Sure.
we do get digital platforms in a usable way that isn't this really big abstraction from what the companies do.
Right.
There comes a second specific issue of having a sectoral regulator that covers these things, and that is regulatory capture, which is something you talk about specifically with some of these sector-specific companies. So if you could give a little bit of background on what regulatory capture generally is and how it looks in these things, and why this is a problem with sector-specific regulators.
Sure. So regulatory capture is the general idea, kind of initiated by, it's a lot older than George Stigler, but he was the guy who kind of named it as an economic phenomenon. He argued that regulation is acquired by the industry and is designed and operated primarily for its benefit. It goes against this sort of more romantic idea of regulation, that regulators are controlling the industry, that they are sort of adversarial to the industry. And it says actually industry parties have a lot of interest in making sure that the rules go their way. And for some very clear public choice reasons, they very often can control the outcomes of these agencies, or even if not control them, they can adapt to them. And even in a non sort of malicious way, a regulator becomes sort of symbiotic with the incumbents, and together they have concerns about disruption. So both the industry incumbents and the existing regulator, their existence is sort of justified by each other. And if there's a disruptive technology that might upend the industry, that also might threaten the regulator. And so you get this symbiosis between the regulator and the regulated that can harm competition and ultimately harm consumers. And so there's been a lot of, regulatory capture is a commonly understood concept. But what I was driving home at in the chapter is that while all agencies tend towards regulatory capture, sector-specific agencies are particularly vulnerable to it, primarily because there's a much smaller audience that they govern, and the expertise that they need to govern that audience is drawn essentially from that industry. And so there's no surprise that the sort of the thinking tends to really be favorable to the incumbents, even in the regulatory environment. Now, again, I worked at the Federal Trade Commission. I know I have lots of friends who work at industry-specific regulators like the Federal Communications Commission. Capture is not necessary. It's not the same as bribery, right? It's just the idea that you can have this sort of Procrustean problem sometimes, right? Where you have a regulatory framework that's set up for the incumbent industry, and nothing else fits into that framework, especially new disruptive technologies. And so regulatory capture is particularly problematic in fast moving industries like the internet and internet based services.
Yeah. So with this, trying to create a sector specific regulator, this tendency towards capture, but then also the need for a actual industry expertise to make a regulator work so that it's not people that know nothing about it working towards it. One of the proposals, as you mentioned, calls for employees with digital DNA. How do you see a way for either an existing agency to gain expertise or a new agency to do it without subjecting themselves to potential capture problems, or is this just something kind of inherent in the system that we have to deal with?
So, like I said, I think all agencies do tend towards this. So it is, it's incumbent on Congress, for example, to practice good oversight of agencies to sort of resist some of this. Now, the public choice literature will also suggest that actually that is one of the way that industry captures is by capturing the oversight committees of Congress. And so that's not a foolproof plan either. What I would say is the agencies that have had the least problem with capture are ones that focus on enforcement of general, broadly applicable principles, where there isn't, if I'm an agency and if I'm a company and an agency is writing rules that directly affect my business, I have a really strong incentive to go in and shape what those rules look like. If, on the other hand, I am a company and the Federal Trade Commission is enforcing its unfairness and deception authority or is bringing antitrust cases, I mostly don't have a strong incentive to go in and talk to those guys or try to capture them. I mostly have a strong incentive to keep my head down. And so I think when you look at enforcement-driven agencies like the FTC, I think it's both that they have a general jurisdiction, but I think it's also that their mandate is not to write rules. It's to bring cases. And that totally shifts the incentives of the regulated industry to focus more on compliance than on trying to figure out how to shape the rules, because frankly, the rules are quite simple or they've been around for a long time and they're not really changing.
Yeah. So that kind of hits on what my last question is, which is that from this, it sounds like the need for a sector-specific agency kind of has some issues with it, and none of the reports seem to really either grapple with these issues or just accept them as given and move on that this is a good idea.
Right.
So it sounds like the best way to maybe deal with this is to house something inside one of the existing agencies like the FTC, the FCC, or DOJ antitrust division, which already have a lot of these responsibilities within a broader framework.
Right.
So with the practical costs aside, another capture question off of this is that when the generalist agencies deal with repeat players, is there something specific about their design, which it sounds like based on their overall enforcement prerogatives and lack of rulemaking for some of them, not the FCC, but that this kind of prevents capture from being as big of a problem? Is this the case for those generalist agencies, or is there something else that just kind of makes them more effective in this area?
No, yeah, I think, getting back to the three types of expertise, I think all different agencies have all three types of expertise. The FTC has, as people who know the agency knows, has these merger shops that focus on specific industries. But again, their task is not to write rules for that agency. It's to look for very specific types of violations in that industry. And so, if we accept the premise that that the current tools of antitrust are not successful in pursuing competition, protecting competition in the market, which is primarily the focus of these proposals for a new digital regulator, although some of them would assign really broad authority that covers everything from privacy to, media bias to tons of other things.
Mm-hmm.
Putting that aside and just focus on the competition question, it would make sense if we think there's a need for more authority to put it in a place that already has some practice and some expertise in these industries and a track record of staying relatively independent. Now, having said that, if you assign rulemaking authority to an agency like the FTC, and they're going to be writing rules for this industry, they're going to face the same pressures that a sector-specific agency would. The thought is, though, perhaps the fact that they're grounded in a much broader base of authority. There's lots of different actors who are coming in or who care about what the FTC does. And so that may help balance some of the sector-specific rulemaking that agency might be charged to do. So it's not a perfect solution. I just think when we look at the costs and benefits of weighing, creating a new agency versus creating new authority in an existing agency, I think it's pretty clear that the whatever the benefits are of that new authority, the costs are certainly much smaller if we go with a existing agency.
Mm-hmm. So on some of the practical costs, just to circle to that for a second, because that's something that even I guess prior to the discussion of a digital regulator, you got with the current ongoing argument about DOJ and FTC having this, which Dan Crane has a chapter on in the report, which will be interesting. But adding a new regulator, what are some of the practical costs that come along with that might be outweighed by just housing it somewhere that we've discussed?
Well, there's some very mundane costs like support staff, facilities, all of that the sort of economies of scale that you might get by scaling up an existing agency rather than creating a new one. But when you have, especially depending on how wide the jurisdiction of a new agency would be, if its jurisdiction overlaps with the existing jurisdiction of a bunch of different agencies, you have a bunch of coordination costs. You also have a potential for brain drain from other agencies. If a new digital regulator is going to be handling privacy for digital companies, the agency that does that most effectively right now is the FTC, but they do it for the whole economy. So the question is, like, if they're going to go to this new agency, where are we going to get new resources for that? So I think there's a lot of practical costs. This is, in my chapter, I don't dig into this super deeply. It's a little less sexy than, maybe the more theoretical stuff. But I think it is a real cost that has to be weighed as policymakers consider, between those two options.
Yeah. So to wrap up a little bit, wanted to thank you for taking the time to talk with me. I really appreciate it. So for people interested in learning more about whether or not we need a new regulator or agency creation in general, are there some articles or books you would recommend that they check out?
Yeah, I mean, there's some classics like, James Q. Wilson's Bureaucracy is great. Stephen Breyer's Regulation and Its Reform is very good as well. Very comprehensive looks. I will say there isn't a ton of literature on why or how to design new agencies. It's actually interesting. I don't know exactly what that is. It seems like a sort of novel problem and a new area that people should explore. However, I will say that Jonathan R. Macy, I think he's at Yale now, he had a great paper in the Journal of Law, Economics, and Organization. It's called Organizational Design and Political Control of Administrative Agencies. And despite that super boring title, it's very good. And it's very thoughtful about a bunch of these issues, including the risks and benefits of a sector-specific versus a generalist regulator. So I highly recommend that paper.
Got it. So I guess, and then the final question, which I'll ask you the same one I asked John, which is, what non-antitrust book have you been reading that you would recommend?
So I'll confess, I'm writing a book on emergent order. So my favorite book that I've been reading in prep for that is called "Why Information Grows" by this physicist turned philosopher / economist, Cesar Hidalgo. It's a great book. Less intellectual, perhaps. I've been reading the Expanse series, which is incredible, and actually has quite a lot of emergent order issues in it. It's sort of Game of Thrones in space with an alien threat. So actually kind of quite a lot like Game of Thrones, like narratively in a way. It's great. It's great. I love that series, and the TV show is actually quite good as well.
Great. Well, with that, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today, and look forward to reading your chapter when the report comes out this fall.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. I really appreciate it.